The war was supposed to have ended in 1945, with the surrender of Nazi Germany and the Empire of Japan. The world was promised peace, liberation, and a new order built on justice. But as the smoke cleared over ruined cities and mass graves, the victors quietly sealed away documents, struck secret bargains, and erased inconvenient truths. What the public was told was only part of the story. Behind the grand speeches at Yalta and Potsdam, behind the tribunals at Nuremberg and Tokyo, lies a darker record: files stamped top secret, testimonies censored, and archives deliberately sealed for decades. Foreshadows of the Second World War remain unexposed, each one carrying consequences that shaped the Cold War and still bleed into our present day. These truths were not meant for daylight. They are fragments of pacts written in smoke-filled rooms, experiments conducted in silence, massacres buried in forgotten fields, and atrocities erased in the name of power. Tonight, we open those files. Tonight, we uncover 4 truths of the Second World War that still haunt the world today. Chapter 1. The Classified Pact. Beneath Yalta. The image of the Yalta Conference has been immortalized in history books. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, pale and weakened by illness. Seated between Winston Churchill in his military coat and Joseph Stalin, expressionless behind his mustache, the photograph conveys unity, the great alliance of East and West, a promise that Hitler's Reich would be crushed and that peace would follow. But what the photograph does not show are the rooms behind closed doors, the handwritten notes that disappeared, the annexes removed from the official record, and the whispered concessions that would shape the next half-century. The war in Europe was not yet over. The Red Army occupied much of Poland and Eastern Europe, while American and British forces had not yet crossed the Rhine. Roosevelt needed Stalin's pledge to join the war against Japan once Germany surrendered, and Churchill needed to preserve what influence Britain could still claim. In those private sessions, they did more than plan victory. They divided us, continent declassified. Soviet files recovered in the 1990s contain references to what was known in Moscow as Document 17B, a coded annex to the Yalta agreements. This file, marked with NKVD signatures, detailed arrangements that were never mentioned publicly. According to fragments found in the Russian archives, the Allies agreed that in exchange for Soviet participation in the Pacific War, vast territories in Eastern Europe would fall under Moscow's administration with minimal interference. The Western powers, already exhausted by years of war, silently acknowledged Soviet claims over the Baltic states, Eastern Poland, and a sphere of influence that stretched deep into the Balkans. The promise of free elections, which was publicly announced, was known even then to be nothing more than a diplomatic mask. Roosevelt himself confided to his aides that pressing Stalin further would risk losing his cooperation entirely. More disturbing are the references to Operation Curtain, a joint understanding, never admitted, to suppress resistance movements deemed inconvenient to the post-war order. In Poland, the Home Army, loyal to the government in exile in London, had fought bravely in the Warsaw Uprising of 1944. Yet their pleas for Allied support had been met with silence as Soviet forces stood across the Vistula River, refusing to advance. Soviet documents reveal that the NKVD had already prepared to dismantle what remained of this resistance, branding them as fascist collaborators. The files suggest that Western intelligence, through the Office of Strategic Services, was made aware of these plans. Yet, for the sake of maintaining unity, no warnings were given. When Soviet forces finally entered Warsaw, thousands of Home Army fighters were arrested, deported, or executed, their very memory later erased from official Polish history under communist rule. The Yalta agreements also contained provisions concerning the transfer of German scientists and technical specialists. Even before Germany's surrender, both the NKVD and the OSS were compiling lists of high-value individuals, engineers, rocket scientists, chemical weapons experts. Document 17B includes coded language referring to Category A personnel, whose expertise would be exchanged or discreetly transferred across occupation zones. The moral implications were quietly set aside. Men who had designed instruments of terror, who had overseen forced labor, were now seen as assets in a new game. Their knowledge would serve not justice, but the emerging rivalry between East and West. Churchill, ever wary of Stalin's ambitions, kept his own counsel. In October 1944, months before Yalta, he had scribbled on a piece of paper the infamous Percentages Agreement, dividing influence over Eastern Europe between Britain and the Soviet Union. Greece would remain under Western control, while Romania and Bulgaria were largely conceded to Moscow. This slip of paper, initialed by Stalin, was dismissed later as a mere note, but its reality was confirmed at Yalta. Churchill later admitted he felt ashamed of this crude partition, but the decision had already condemned millions to live behind an iron curtain before the term was ever spoken. The betrayal felt in Eastern Europe was immediate. Leaders of the Polish government in exile, invited to Moscow under assurances of cooperation, were instead arrested by the NKVD in March 1945 and placed on trial. The Western Allies, informed of these arrests, protested only weakly. Roosevelt, increasingly frail, believed that maintaining Soviet goodwill was more important than defending Poland's sovereignty. His death in April 1945 removed even that fragile balance. Truman inherited not only the presidency, but also the consequences of the secret agreements at Yalta. The haunting truth is that Yalta was not simply a conference of victors deciding peace. It was the beginning of the Cold War, scripted in secret clauses and hidden memoranda. Entire nations were sacrificed in the name of stability. The rhetoric of liberation masked the reality of partition. The seeds of uprisings in Hungary in 1956, in Prague in 1968, and in Poland's solidarity movement of the 1980s were planted here, in the quiet betrayals of February 1945. For decades, the classified annexes remained buried. Western archives were cleansed, with files marked not to be released until 2015 or later. Soviet records were sealed in vaults beneath Moscow. It was only with the collapse of the Soviet Union that fragments began to surface, painting a picture that contradicted the official history. Survivors of the Home Army spoke of being abandoned by their supposed allies. Documents revealed that OSS reports from the region, which detailed Soviet atrocities, had been deliberately ignored. The truth had been known, but it was too dangerous to acknowledge. The consequences of Yalta continue to echo. The post-war map of Europe was drawn not by liberation, but by convenience. The Baltic states lost their independence for half a century. Eastern Poland was absorbed into the Soviet Union. Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia were handed over to Moscow's grip. Each uprising that followed, each crushed protest, can trace its betrayal back to those sealed rooms in the Crimean resort. The photograph of the Big Three at Yalta remains iconic. Yet behind their smiles and handshakes lies the classified pact that condemned half of Europe to decades of oppression. The West celebrated victory, but at a cost it dared not confess. The people of Eastern Europe paid that price, erased from the promises of freedom. The war may have ended in 1945, but the shadows of Yalta still stretch across Europe, a haunting reminder that peace was purchased not with justice, but with silence. Chapter 2: Forbidden Files of Operation Paperclip. In the ruins of Nazi Germany, as Allied soldiers searched bombed-out bunkers and collapsed laboratories, a new war began. It was not fought with tanks or artillery, but with dossiers, code lists, and extraction teams. The goal was clear: capture the Reich's greatest minds before the Soviets did. What followed was a secret program so morally compromised that its true nature remained hidden for decades. The program was known as Operation Paperclip, though even that name was a sanitized invention. Officially, it was described as a pragmatic effort to secure German expertise for the benefit of Western science. In reality, it was a classified pipeline that smuggled war criminals into the United States, erasing their pasts with the stroke of a pen. These men were not just scientists, they were perpetrators. They had overseen forced labor in underground factories, they had tested weapons on prisoners, and they had designed rockets that brought death to civilian cities. Yet in the shadow of the emerging Cold War, their crimes were buried beneath layers of deception. The story begins in May 1945, as Germany capitulated. The Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, known as the JIOA, compiled blacklists of German specialists. Priority was given to engineers from Peenemünde, the coastal research base where the V-2 rocket had been perfected under the direction of Werner von Braun. The V-2 had rained destruction on London and Antwerp, killing thousands indiscriminately. Allied reports documented the horrific conditions at Mittelbau-Dora, the underground facility where prisoners from concentration camps were worked to death building these rockets. More than 20,000 men perished there, their bodies discarded in shallow pits. Von Braun himself visited Dora, knew of the starvation and executions, and yet continued his work. By any measure, these were crimes against humanity. Yet in June 1945, American officers discreetly transported von Braun and his closest colleagues into Bavaria, shielding them from possible prosecution. The first files reveal how easily truth was rewritten. Operation Overcast, the predecessor to Paperclip, began as a limited program to interrogate German scientists. But as tensions with the Soviet Union sharpened, the scope expanded. In September 1945, President Truman authorized the recruitment of specialists, but only on the condition that they had clean records. This safeguard was quietly bypassed. The JO simply altered documents. Nazi party memberships were omitted. SS affiliations were erased. Concentration camp connections were reclassified as alleged. When von Braun's file was submitted, references to his SS rank were removed. Dozens of others were similarly laundered. A paperclip attached to their new files indicated the sanitized versions, the source of the program's eventual name. By 1946, hundreds of German scientists had been brought to American soil. They were settled at Fort Bliss in Texas, at White Sands in New Mexico, and later at Redstone Arsenal in Alabama. There they began testing rockets under US Army supervision. In photographs from the time, von Braun appears smiling, pointing at launch towers beneath the desert sun, as if the horrors of Dora had never happened. Official press releases describe them as engineers, experts, valuable contributors. What was not mentioned was their past. Survivors of Mittelbau Dora, many of whom testified at the Dora Mittelbau trial in Dachau in 1947, described a reality of starvation, hanging executions and beatings. Yet the very men who had overseen these facilities were now working under US contracts, their testimonies excluded from the record. The moral cost was staggering. While the United States presented itself as the champion of justice at the Nuremberg trials, it simultaneously shielded men who should have stood in the dock. The Soviets, fully aware of this hypocrisy, exploited it in their propaganda, but they too engaged in their own hunt. Operation WWII, launched in October 1946, forcibly relocated more than 2,000 German specialists and their families to the Soviet Union. Entire research institutes were dismantled overnight, shipped east by train. The Cold War arms race began not in the 1950s, but in these desperate months, as former Nazis were transformed into prized assets. Perhaps the most disturbing revelations are found in the suppressed medical files. Among those brought to the United States were physicians connected to experiments at Dachau, where hypothermia trials and high-altitude tests had killed scores of prisoners. Though many were convicted at the Nuremberg doctors' trial, others were quietly spared. Paperclip files reference Category C scientists, those with questionable backgrounds, whose recruitment was marked essential. Their names were hidden for decades, only emerging when investigative journalists forced declassification in the 1980s. Reports show that biological warfare research in the early Cold War drew directly on data taken from these human experiments. Information bought with human suffering was now repurposed as a weapon against the Soviet threat. Werner von Braun's career illustrates the full extent of this bargain. By the 1950s, he was a leading figure in the US missile program, responsible for the Redstone and Jupiter rockets. By the 1960s, he stood beside President Kennedy, head of NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center, hailed as the architect of the Saturn V rocket that carried men to the moon. His past at Dora was buried under layers of patriotic imagery. Survivors of the camps wrote letters of protest, but these were ignored. The price of American triumph in the space race was silence over the origins of its technology. The forbidden files of Operation Paperclip were not intended for public release. They were stamped classified, their contents known only to a select circle within the Pentagon and the intelligence community, but fragments leaked. In 1947, a report prepared for the Joint Chiefs of Staff noted ethical objections to the program. The report was suppressed. In the 1950s, congressional inquiries were quietly deflected. Only in the 1970s, under the pressure of the Freedom of Information Act, did thousands of pages emerge. Even then, many files were heavily redacted, names blacked out, entire pages missing. The truth was revealed piece by piece, forcing historians to reconstruct what had been deliberately erased. What these documents show is not just the recruitment of former Nazis, but the rewriting of history itself. Men who had overseen atrocities were presented as pioneers. Their victims were silenced, their testimonies forgotten. The Cold War demanded speed, and morality was seen as a luxury. The United States justified its actions by pointing to the Soviet threat, claiming that without Paperclip, the enemy would have gained a decisive advantage. But this justification ignores the fact that justice was sacrificed in the process. The very ideals for which the war had supposedly been fought, freedom, accountability, the rejection of tyranny, were compromised in secret. The legacy of Operation Paperclip is visible even today. Every time images of the Apollo program are celebrated, the shadow of Dora lingers. The rockets that carried astronauts into orbit were the descendants of weapons that had once carried death to civilians. The men who designed them had walked both paths. The truth cannot be separated, no matter how carefully files were scrubbed. The forbidden files reveal not just a hidden chapter of history, but a contradiction at the heart of the modern world. Victory built on silence, progress purchased with complicity, and justice abandoned in the name of power. Chapter 3: Hidden Massacres of the Eastern Front. The Eastern Front of the Second World War was not simply a battlefield. It was a vast killing ground, where entire populations were swallowed by violence, starvation, and deliberate extermination. Between 1941 and 1945, from the plains of Ukraine to the forests of Belarus and the marshes of the Baltics, millions perished in ways that never reached Western newsreels. The Nazi Wehrmacht advanced with brutal efficiency, burning villages, executing civilians, and leaving behind smoldering ruins. But their atrocities were only half of the story. Soviet forces, in their desperate retreats and later in their triumphant return, committed purges, mass arrests, and reprisals that erased whole communities. What remains hidden in classified Soviet archives, only partially opened after 1991, is evidence of massacres carried out not only by the invaders, but also by the very army that claimed to liberate. These villages, obliterated without record, became known among survivors as the erased places, where memory itself was silenced by political decree. One of the most haunting cases is that of Katyn in Belarus. On March 22, 1943, Nazi troops, assisted by collaborators from the Schutzmannschaft Battalion 118, burned the village to the ground and murdered 149 inhabitants, most of them women and children. For decades, Katyn was presented in Soviet propaganda as a symbol of German brutality. Yet documents uncovered in Minsk reveal a more complex story. Dozens of similar massacres were carried out not only by German units, but also by NKVD squads against suspected partisan sympathizers. Villages accused of aiding resistance fighters were torched, their populations deported or executed. Soviet reports of these operations were filed under codenames like Operation Silence, designed to ensure that only German crimes were memorialized, while Soviet massacres were erased. The victims were buried in unmarked pits, their names removed from records, their deaths absorbed into a narrative that tolerated no contradiction. The scale of destruction on the Eastern Front defies imagination. Entire regions of Belarus lost over a quarter of their population. Thousands of villages were burned, some multiple times. In Ukraine, the Nazi policy of hunger blockade starved millions, while Soviet scorched earth orders deliberately destroyed crops and livestock during retreats, leaving civilians with nothing. Classified Red Army files detail operations where suspected collaborators, sometimes entire hamlets, were rounded up and shot without trial. Families accused of feeding German soldiers were branded traitors, even when survival left them no choice. Western intelligence received scattered reports of these atrocities through Polish resistance networks and OSS intercepts. Yet the information was considered too politically sensitive. Acknowledging Soviet crimes risked fracturing the alliance before Germany was defeated, so the documents were marked confidential, filed away, and ignored. The NKVD maintained extensive records of its operations, but many were destroyed or sealed after the war. Surviving fragments describe a chilling bureaucracy of erasure. Reports speak of resettlements that were in fact mass deportations, special operations that meant executions, quarantine zones that concealed burned villages. The language of classification obscured the reality of death. For survivors, the consequences were permanent. When they attempted to testify, their voices were silenced. In Stalin's Soviet Union, speaking of Soviet atrocities was considered treason. Those who tried were arrested, sent to labor camps, or forced into silence. Thus, the memory of thousands of massacres vanished not only under rubble, but under censorship. Even after the war, the manipulation of memory continued. The Soviet Union heavily promoted the story of Katyn, though not the massacre carried out by the NKVD against Polish officers in 1940, but a fabricated version blaming the Nazis. For decades, the official narrative inverted reality. Only in 1990 did Moscow admit responsibility. By then, survivors had grown old, many dying before they saw the truth acknowledged. Katyn was not an isolated case. Soviet archives contain references to other massacres in 1941 and 1942, where Polish, Ukrainian, and Baltic civilians were executed en masse. Entire files remain missing, believed destroyed during the late Stalin years. The pattern is clear. Atrocities committed by the enemy were broadcast. Atrocities committed by the state were erased. The Western allies were not innocent in this silence. British and American officials, aware of the Katyn massacre through intelligence sources, deliberately suppressed the information during the war. Public acknowledgement would have threatened the alliance with Stalin. Churchill himself admitted privately that the Soviets had committed the crime but ordered his cabinet to remain quiet. Roosevelt's administration took the same position. After the war, with the onset of the Cold War, Katyn became a weapon of propaganda, used by the West to highlight Soviet cruelty, while the Soviets continued to deny responsibility. Truth became a pawn in the larger conflict, leaving victims as forgotten casualties of politics. The hidden massacres of the Eastern Front are not confined to Belarus or Poland. In the Baltic states, tens of thousands were deported during Soviet reoccupation in 1944-45. Entire families packed into cattle cars bound for Siberian camps. Officially, these deportations were framed as punishment for collaboration. In reality, many were simply ordinary villagers caught between armies, accused without evidence. The documents reveal chilling details. Lists of children under the age of 10 included in deportation orders, property inventories seized by the state, entire villages depopulated overnight. Western observers saw glimpses of this, but remained silent, unwilling to challenge the post-war settlement agreed at Yalta. Ghost towns still dot the forests of Eastern Europe. Some remain ruins, overtaken by moss and silence. Others were rebuilt, but their original inhabitants never returned. Mass graves continue to surface, uncovered by farmers or construction crews, often without markers. DNA testing in the 21st century has begun to identify victims, but the official histories remain vague. In Belarus, memorials emphasize German crimes but omit Soviet ones. In Ukraine, new research has uncovered Soviet massacres long denied under communist rule. Each revelation reignites debates about memory, justice, and complicity. Yet the deeper truth remains. Entire populations were deliberately erased, their deaths hidden not only by the perpetrators, but by those who claim to liberate them. The haunting aspect of these massacres is not only the violence itself, but the silence that followed. Villages burned and rebuilt without markers, survivors intimidated into silence, archives sealed or destroyed, and Western governments complicit in this erasure for the sake of political necessity. The war on the Eastern Front was not just fought with weapons, but with control over memory. The truth was buried as deliberately as the bodies in the forests. The hidden massacres still haunt because they reveal that liberation and occupation were often indistinguishable, and that victory in war did not guarantee justice for the dead. Chapter 4. The Erased Truth of Unit 731. In the northern reaches of Manchuria, near the city of Harbin, stood a compound so secret that even its name was designed to mislead. Officially, it was the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army. In reality, it was Unit 731, the most notorious biological warfare facility of the Second World War. Behind its walls, Japanese doctors and scientists conducted experiments on living human beings with a cruelty that defies comprehension. Prisoners, Chinese peasants, Korean laborers, Soviet captives, and even Western POWs were referred to as maruta, meaning logs. They were not seen as people, but as test material. Vivisections were performed without anesthesia to observe the effects of disease on living tissue. Subjects were deliberately infected with plague, cholera, and anthrax. Others were exposed to freezing temperatures until their limbs turned black with frostbite, then thawed in boiling water. Entire villages were targeted with plague bombs, their wells poisoned, their crops contaminated. By conservative estimates, more than 200,000 civilians died as a result of Unit 731's programs. And yet, at the end of the war, its perpetrators did not face justice. They were not paraded before tribunals like at Nuremberg. Instead, they were erased from the official record, protected, shielded, and even rewarded. The explanation lies in a secret bargain struck in 1945. When Japan surrendered in August, the United States occupied the ruins of its empire. General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander for the Allied powers, quickly realized that the data produced by Unit 731 was of immense value in the emerging confrontation with the Soviet Union. Unlike Nazi doctors at Dachau or Auschwitz, the Japanese researchers had tested biological weapons on a large scale. They had entire datasets on plague epidemics, anthrax dispersal, and frostbite endurance. Such information could not be replicated ethically, and in the paranoid calculus of the Cold War, it was deemed too valuable to destroy. US intelligence operatives, working under the Chemical Warfare Service, entered into direct negotiations with Unit 731 leaders, including its commander, General Shiro Ishii. In exchange for immunity from prosecution, Ishii and his colleagues turned over their research, complete with autopsy reports, laboratory notes, and testimonies of field trials carried out on civilians. These documents were stamped eyes only, classified at the highest levels, and transported to Washington, D.C. Survivors of Unit 731's horrors were silenced. Their testimonies never appeared at the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal. The official records of the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, held in Tokyo between 1946 and 1948, are conspicuously silent on Unit 731. Charges of biological warfare were not pursued. Soviet prosecutors attempted to raise the issue, but they were blocked by American counterparts who insisted there was insufficient evidence. What the Soviets did not know, or pretended not to know, was that Washington had already secured the evidence in secret. Declassified cables from the Office of Strategic Services, the precursor to the CIA, revealed discussions of valuable intelligence from Ishii. By 1947, Ishii himself was living freely in Japan, shielded from trial, while many of his subordinates took up respectable positions in academia, medicine, and government. One became head of the Japanese National Institute of Health. Another rose to prominence in the pharmaceutical industry. Their crimes were buried, replaced by sanitized biographies. The Soviet Union, however, pursued its own investigations. In December 1949, the Khabarovsk war crimes trials were convened, where 12 Japanese officers were tried for biological warfare. Unlike the Tokyo Tribunal, the Soviets presented detailed testimonies from Unit 731 personnel, describing plague experiments, frostbite tests, and human vivisections. Western governments dismissed these proceedings as propaganda. For decades, they were treated as fabrications of Stalinist show trials. Only in the 1980s and 1990s, when Japanese and American archives began to open, did researchers realize that the Soviet evidence was largely accurate. The chilling truth is that both superpowers had knowledge of Unit 731. The Soviets used it for propaganda while quietly continuing their own biological warfare research. The Americans suppressed it entirely, folding the stolen data into their classified programs at Fort Detrick in Maryland. The survivors of Unit 731, mostly Chinese civilians, never received recognition. Their suffering was omitted from history textbooks. Families who lost loved ones to plague bombs in Zhejiang and Hunan provinces during Operation Cherry Blossoms at Night, a Japanese plan to spread biological agents, were left without acknowledgement. When survivors attempted to sue the Japanese government decades later, their cases were dismissed on the grounds of insufficient evidence. Even today, Japanese courts have never formally recognized responsibility for Unit 731's crimes. The erasure was deliberate. It protected not only the perpetrators, but also the nations that benefited from their data. The documents that have since emerged paint a picture of systematic dehumanization. Reports describe test chambers lined with iron, where pressure and temperature could be manipulated to extreme levels. Prisoners were injected with animal blood to study rejection. Others were placed in centrifuges until their organs collapsed. Women were impregnated under coercion to study maternal transmission of disease. Children were dissected to examine bone growth under starvation. These horrors were recorded in meticulous scientific detail, with photographs, charts, and autopsy sketches. Yet instead of serving as evidence at trials, they became research material for Cold War laboratories. The reports were not destroyed. They were locked away in vaults, labeled top secret, and consulted by military planners who never acknowledged their origin. The haunting legacy of Unit 731 lies not only in the suffering inflicted, but in the silence that followed. Unlike Auschwitz, Dachau, or Nuremberg, There was no international reckoning. The perpetrators walked free, many living long lives in comfort. The victims were denied justice, their deaths reduced to footnotes or denied altogether. For decades, even in Japan, discussion of Unit 731 was taboo. Textbooks glossed over the atrocities. Politicians avoided acknowledgement. It was only through the testimony of a handful of whistleblowers, such as former nurse Toyo Ishii, that fragments of the truth began to reach the public. She described disposing of bodies, sometimes still alive, as part of the unit's routine. Her words, dismissed for years, now stand as some of the few first-hand accounts available. The erased truth of Unit 731 is perhaps the most disturbing of all the Second World War's hidden files. It reveals not only the depths of human cruelty, but the willingness of victorious powers to conceal atrocities for strategic gain. The immunity granted to Shiro Ishii and his colleagues was not an oversight, it was a decision. A choice to value data over justice, to prioritize advantage over morality. Every treaty against biological weapons signed in the decades that followed is haunted by this decision. For beneath the signatures and promises lies the knowledge that the first large-scale biological warfare experiments were never punished, only purchased. The war may have ended in 1945, but in the archives of Washington, Moscow, and Tokyo, the truth of Unit 731 remains a scar that has never healed. The Second World War ended in fire and triumph, but its shadows were never lifted. Beneath the monuments and parades, beneath the speeches of liberation and justice, lie files that were never meant to see daylight. At Yalta, secret pacts betrayed nations in the name of stability. Through Operation Paperclip, men who should have stood trial were given new lives, their crimes erased in exchange for knowledge. On the Eastern Front, entire villages were wiped from existence, their massacres concealed not only by the perpetrators, but by their supposed liberators. And in Manchuria, Unit 731 turned human beings into test subjects, with the evidence of their agony locked away, traded for advantage in a new war. These truths were not accidents. They were deliberate choices, made in silence, signed in secret, and sealed in classified archives. They haunt us because they reveal that victory was built not on justice, but on compromise. They linger because the consequences are still alive, in alliances shaped by betrayal, in technologies born from atrocity, in graves without names. The war has been over for 80 years, but the secrets remain. And as long as they remain, the world cannot claim it has truly left the Second World War behind.